everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We are so fortunate and honored to have with us a special guest, Mr. Ming Wai Lau. To provide some background, Mr. Lau is the chairman of the Bauhinia Foundation Research Center, an independent policy think tank. Additionally, he's the director of MWYO, a youth-oriented think and do tank, and the chairman of Chinese Estates Holdings Limited. Mr. Lau also holds Bachelor of Laws, Master of Laws, and doctorate degrees from King's College London and the London School of Economics. His doctoral dissertation was published as a book by Oxford University Press in 2011. Additionally, during 2014 to 2020, he served as a visiting lecturer at Harvard Law School. Unfortunate, I missed out on his classes. Outside of these aforementioned ventures, Mr. Lau is also a registered attorney in the state of New York and a CFA certified charter holder. He's very active in public affairs in Hong Kong, serving not only as the vice chairman of the Youth Development Commission, but also as the chairman of the board of the Ocean Park Corporation, a member of the Exchange Fund Advisory Committee, and a member of the Chief Executive's Council of Advisors on Innovation and Strategic Development. In 2017, he was awarded the Gold Bauhinia Star for his meritorious public and community service. As such, we at HPAIR are super delighted to host this fireside chat with Mr. Lau. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Evin.
No worries. We are the ones who should be honored right now. I'd love to dive into some questions about long-term problems just facing Asia and also a specific region dear to both our hearts, Hong Kong. But before we do, I'd love to ask you some questions about your background and formational experiences, if you don't mind. I know that you've had extensive education in the UK, as we've previously mentioned, having obtained multiple degrees from the LSE and King's College. Tell us, how have your experiences overseas in Europe affected your intellectual development and just overall views?
No, I think it's made me more European. So I went to high school mostly in Hong Kong and a little bit in Canada, but most of my friends in Hong Kong, this was an international school, high school, they went to college in the US. And they spent 4 years of their lives there and then went back to Hong Kong. I spent 9 years in London. What I think is different between an American college experience and a European college experience is the culture and the exposure. Now, America definitely is not a monoculture. There's a lot of diversity in America as well. But I think in Europe, whether you study in London or Manchester or Paris or Rome, you are on a platform where you can be exposed to dozens of very different, very unique culture. And it's not just about the food or the language or the people. It's the politics in each country, the societies in each country. All that I think enriched my my college and post-college experience, which I think it's possible to replicate in the US, but it's harder.
Okay. Did you have any specific experiences that you thought were particularly eye-opening or just memorable?
There are too many to count. My ex-wife spent 2 years in Paris.
Oh, that's
so I, with the Eurostar train, I practically commuted to Paris on most or every other weekend. So in that sense, a lot of the daily little details of living in Paris somehow I digested, and it's through these experiences that I think I know more about French people than, say, my peers who studied in the US and might have done a semester abroad somewhere in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So it's much more worldly experience, I guess, from what you've said.
It's exposure. It's exposure, and it's not. And with semesters abroad or year abroad, so especially with semesters abroad type, it's a very short, compressed experience. Whereas my experience is 9 years worth through travel, through interacting with people, through living in different places. So I think all that is part of me today.
Mm-hmm. Very wise statement. Thank you very much for that just brief overview about like your early life and everything. Now, let's move on to some questions about Hong Kong. So for well over a century, Hong Kong has acted as a economic and a cultural nexus. In your opinion, what conditions fostered Hong Kong's ability to be like an exchange route, like a nexus as a entrepot between East and West in the first place?
I think you can talk about British governance. You can talk about rule of law. You can talk about all that, and then those are important factors. But one interesting historical curiosity is that from the colonial days up to modern day today, Hong Kong thrived in one way or another on China's barriers or insularity. Back in the early colonial days, the Qing dynasty didn't want to trade with foreigners, and Hong Kong acted as a go-between. And even to this day, China has a closed capital account system. So all the financial flows with the outside world mostly still go through Hong Kong. So I think that is a big part of Hong Kong's success as well, ironically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, building on that, talking about just Hong Kong's economic success, building on that, today it's still certainly a financial powerhouse. But as the world becomes increasingly globalized, it starts to lose its niche as the only remaining nexus between the East and the West. So what do you see as Hong Kong's new role in today's society?
So I think the global financial piece has at least 10 to 15 more years to run. And I think one day China will liberalize its capital accounts, and Shanghai would be well positioned to compete with Hong Kong in a serious manner. But I think the next stage of the Hong Kong story lies in the Greater Bay Area. You may or may not have heard of Greater Bay Area, but it's the region of Hong Kong plus southern Guangdong province. Includes Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and a host of other cities. 11 in total. And Pearl River Delta, indeed. 11 cities in total. That is turning up to become a innovation, R&D, and manufacturing powerhouse. And I think Hong Kong has a lot to offer on that beyond financial services, beyond IPO. Hong Kong has 10 or even more universities, many of them very high in the world rankings. We can produce the researchers, the scholars, the scientists that fuel the innovation in the Greater Bay Area.
Building on that, what do you think Hong Kong needs to do to maintain its competitiveness in the long run? Or do we just continue along the status quo, continue along its path right now?
There are several things which we'll delve into in other discussions or questions later on. But I think, look, Hong Kong has the right assets, has the right tools to adapt and to thrive well into the future. And I mentioned the Greater Bay Area and the rest of China. I think the government, the local population, everyone needs to really change the way they think about Hong Kong and China, or Hong Kong and the mainland. Until maybe 10 years ago, our government officials still plan Hong Kong within the four corners of the Hong Kong map. They don't, north of the Shenzhen border, it's none of their business. That mindset is gradually changing, but it's not fast enough. And the same goes with businesses. The same goes with regular citizens. The way we live, the way we work, the companies we want to work for. I think that all needs to take on a more integrated approach with the mainland in the future. That doesn't have to compromise Hong Kong attributes or Hong Kong values, but I think we need to really to use a cliche, think out of the box.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you for that really insightful answer. Just talking about the future. And right now, I hate to do this, but to switch back and look about the past, actually, other countries have really tried to emulate, to varying degrees of success, Hong Kong and more generally the four Asian tigers' extraordinary economic success. Do you think that it's possible for these developing economies outside of Asia? You see a lot in Africa, some within Asia, some in Latin America. Do you think it's possible for these countries today to experience the same growth as the East Asian countries did back in the 70s and 80s? Or are there certain limitations or restrictions to how much they can grow now?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible for different countries. You mentioned Africa, you mentioned Asia. I definitely think it's possible. It won't be easy. It's probably more difficult than in the 70s or 80s when the four Asian tigers did it. You need a lucky confluence of a lot of factors. The economies need to be the right size. You see, the four Asian tigers are generally smallish economies with small to medium-sized population. You need to be in the right place. Your neighbors need to be either opening up or growing or have demand for what you produce. And I see Southeast Asia, the likes of Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. These places still have a lot of potential, and equally with Africa. I think once you have the time and place, once you're in the right time and right place, I think the remaining challenge or remaining factor would be governance. You need the right policies, you need the right leaders in place to make those happen. The four Asian tigers didn't succeed just because they were in the right place at the right time, but rather their governments and to some extent their businesses and people, did the right thing at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of studies like Asimoglu and Robinson also talked about institutions and their roles as well. That's a very insightful answer that really combines everything. And we've talked a lot about success right now, but as with anything, there are two sides to every coin. On the flip side of its spectacular economic development, Hong Kong has also been ranked the least affordable housing market in the world for 8 years in a row. Speaking personally, I know my uncle who works as a taxi cab driver and he lives in Samsui, has to pay an exorbitant amount of exorbitantly high price to live in one of those small subdivided apartments. Now, housing prices are around 20 times higher than the average income. While the population is bound to grow in the foreseeable future, the amount of land is undoubtedly finite, right? In your opinion, what can be done to combat this housing crisis?
The solution, Evan, is incredibly simple. More supply. Increase the supply of land, flood the market with more land and more apartments, and I'm sure prices will come down. Now, for such a simple solution, you're right to ask, why hasn't it been done? We as a developed, advanced society have the usual baggage of NIMBYism, city planning restrictions, protected areas, national parks, country parks, all that sort of good stuff are sand in the machinery that makes it much slower, much harder to produce land. The discussion, I think, is getting more and more contentious, and the remedies that are being discussed are more and more extreme. In the good old days, you just say government should increase the sale of land. Now we are debating whether we should invade and take land from our country parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, to whether we should take the periphery of these parks to build more housing. Personally, I think we should, because I think I don't think your uncle or others should be living in those subdivided flats. Mm-hmm. We have a very high percentage. I think more than half of Hong Kong land are actually country park land, protected. Oh, we don't need half of Hong Kong to be country parks. We need more housing. So I think we can afford to pinch a little bit of country park land and other protected land in the name of solving the housing crisis.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this will be something, a step that the government will actually take moving forward, or what do you think is a feasible plan, or what do you think is a feasible step for the government? What do you think they will actually do?
I think you know because the housing crisis is only getting worse and worse as time goes by, and the national leaders in Beijing have repeatedly say, solve this housing crisis, please. I think the more extreme measures, whether it's through reclamation of land by the sea or country park, those will more and more likely be adopted, because those are the solutions that can provide the largest number of housing units in the shortest available time. All other solutions touted by academics, by other people, are they don't really solve the problem in meaningful quantity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your insightful answer. And similar to the housing crisis we just talked about, poverty is also a serious problem in Hong Kong, with a poverty rate of around 20% recorded in 2019. And certainly with the COVID-19 pandemic that's stretched for a very long time, this number may actually be higher now than it was recorded 2 years ago. As someone who serves to some capacity on the Commission for Poverty, what do you think can be done to combat this fundamental problem in Hong Kong?
There are many aspects to, I think, solving poverty in Hong Kong. The safety net, I think if we talk about social security or safety net, that can always be expanded. Mm-hmm. That can always be expanded. The second one is housing, which we just talked about, because a big chunk of anyone's income goes to housing. So when you can make housing affordable, people will have more disposable income to use. But I think at a more structural level, it goes back to the pyramid nature of jobs in Hong Kong. There are simply not enough high quality jobs in Hong Kong that whose salaries can afford a reasonable standard of living. It's definitely true for jobs requiring college education. I'm of the view that the 10 universities produce far more undergrads, fresh grads, that the labor market can take up. And then, this is the case with the US as well, with Taiwan, with a lot of places. Over the last 30, 40 years, Hong Kong, like a lot of other countries, want to empower people with education, rightly so. But with that comes the expectation that a college degree will land you in a very decent white-collar job, which was the case in the 70s and 80s, but less and less so these days. So the labor market in Hong Kong simply doesn't have the capacity to take on these people. And then, I think a big part of the solution will involve looking for opportunities outside of Hong Kong, whether it's immediately outside of Hong Kong, like the Greater Bay Area, or the rest of China, or the rest of the world. We do have well-trained, well-educated labor force that are suitable for work opportunities anywhere in the world, to be honest. And it's setting them up for these opportunities. It's connecting them with these opportunities that I think we should do. I think all these steps go a long way towards reducing poverty.
Thank you. And I guess Hong Kong is certainly fortunate enough to be in a situation where it can offer and extend just a social security net. But if I may extrapolate a little bit, what do you propose for countries that have the same problem of just poverty or huge wealth inequality that don't necessarily have the institutional capacity to offer strong social security networks?
That's a very tough question, Evin. I mean, if I can sort of hone in on young people, because as you mentioned in my bio, that's one of my focuses. Obviously, poverty extends to not just young people, but on young people, I think you're seeing similar trends across the developed world in UK, US, Taiwan, Japan, Canada. Young people are earning less and less in real terms, and the social mobility for young people is generally stuck or even negative trending. The and no one in the developed world seems to have cracked this puzzle so far. I do think it's compounded by an aging and longer living population. The older people just aren't dying out as quickly as they did. And when older people simply work longer, the upward mobility simply, I think simply is reduced. So some form of, I think, redistribution, not just in terms of cash or money, but in terms of assets, in terms of jobs. These are all touted or discussed across the rich world, and I think more government intervention is required to solve this. But unfortunately, like other people, I don't have a magic solution to this yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, but that was still a very good answer, regardless. Just combining everything, and sorry for just unleashing that out of the blue. But now, after talking about wealth, let's talk about something less dismal, or depending on who you view, more dismal, some geopolitics. Before we dive too deep into specifics, let's quickly touch upon a topic that's constantly floating around Southeast Asian political discourse. When we talk about Hong Kong, quite often you hear the phrase "one country, two systems" being brought up. Now, for the people in the audience who aren't quite familiar with the Chinese constitution, can you briefly explain what this phrase means?
So basically, in a nutshell, Evin, one country, two system is where China allows Hong Kong to operate in a system that is different from its own. The reason for having this, you have to go back to the 70s and 80s when the Brits and the Chinese were negotiating over Hong Kong. China was an emerging economy back then. Back in those days, I think Hong Kong constituted more than 1/4 of China GDP. So you had a very rich and developed Hong Kong versus a very emerging, if not poor, China back in the 70s and 80s. Now, the socialist system back then wasn't the right fit for Hong Kong. And if China tried to apply that socialist political economic system on Hong Kong is just going to fail. This was agreed by the Chinese and the Brits. So they devised this solution whereby the prevailing system in Hong Kong, the capitalist, liberal-ish system, could remain after the handover and remain for 50 years. So that was a workaround to the uneven position between the mainland and Hong Kong back then.
Thank you. Now that you've given us just a really good overview of the one country, two systems principle, I'd like to ask you a question directly pertaining to it. Now, recently, with the passing of the Hong Kong National Security Law, as well as the National People's Congress reform of the Hong Kong electoral system, many pundits, many commentators, and government officials across the world have described this as being the end of the one country, two systems era. Do you think that this evaluation is legitimate? And if so, what does this entail for the future of Hong Kong?
My short answer is no. It's not the end of the system. My long answer is, I think time will tell. Time will tell how what I call OCTS, one country, two system, how OCTS develops. My answer is no, for the simple reason we still have two systems. Mm-hmm. We still have two systems in place. We are still a low tax, freewheeling capitalist system. We still have some directly elected, democratically elected legislators. I say some because the system was never fully democratically elected. So all these things are still in place. So definitely, it's not the end of OCTS. I can understand why commentators will say that, because if you look at what trauma Hong Kong has gone through in the last 2 to 3 years, we've had what I call two very violent pendulum swings. Mm-hmm. You went from sort of pre-2019. Pre-2019 was when we had all the protests and riots and stuff. Pre-2019, Hong Kong was quote unquote fine. 2019, the pendulum swung one way where everyone thought this is so bad, the government's going to get overthrown. The PLA, the army is going to sense from the Chinese perspective. From the Chinese perspective, it's by the way, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's perfectly fine on my end, I think.
Okay, so sorry, I saw your freeze, but let me start again. From the Chinese perspective. Mm-hmm. From the Chinese perspective, it was their one country that was being attacked. Because Western critics focus on the two systems arrangement being attacked. But I think from the eyes in the eyes of the Chinese leaders, it was the one country that was being attacked. So you had a very violent swing of the pendulum to one side. Now, all the subsequent developments since 2019, including the national security law, the political reform, the arrest and prosecution of a lot of activists, you can argue that was the second violent pendulum swing. And when Hong Kong gets jolted like this in such a short space of time, your critics or commentators and even your average citizens will ask, "What's going on? Is this the end of Hong Kong as we know it?" So I think these reactions are very very normal given what we've been through. We've been here before, though. 2014, when I first taught at Harvard, 2014 was a year we had Occupy Central. That felt like a closed moment back then. We thought that was bad until we had 2019. But 2014 was bad, and in the eyes of China was also an infringement or a threat to one country. And back then, equally, the pendulum swung. The pendulum swung back in China's favor with a lot of legislation, with a lot of assertion of sovereignty. So what I'm saying is, these violent pendulum swings will shake confidence, but I'm of the view that it's in China's best interest to keep one country, two system in place. It's in its best interest from a financial perspective, from a geopolitical perspective. So I'm of the view that I think this will be in place into the foreseeable future.
That's like a very, very interesting, I guess, approach to viewing it, because I guess in the West is where I am. We're very acclimatized, very accustomed to just seeing it when the pendulum swings, as you've mentioned. So I guess just seeing a reaction and just like a reaction to it, seeing that there's like reactions at both ends, I think that adds a lot of depth and nuance to a commonly held perception. And I guess we'll just ask one more question on the topic of geopolitics, and it's from the Western side, with the US, amongst other countries, ending special treatment of Hong Kong as evinced by President Trump's Hong Kong Autonomy Act in 2020, which ends the territory's special status. Do you think that Hong Kong can maintain its position as an economic powerhouse in Southeast Asia with these policies being implemented? I know you touched on this a bit, but particularly with these specific policies, what do you see?
I think the American treatment of Hong Kong in recent years will not dethrone Hong Kong's place in the world. Other other countries, other regions, other places are still treating Hong Kong uniquely and separately. So yes, America is an important business, trading, economic partner with Hong Kong and China, but that's not the end of the story. But you know, I wouldn't be complacent. If I were Hong Kong or Chinese leaders, I wouldn't be complacent. Our unique status is earned. We have to earn it. We have to maintain it. We have to do things to earn the trust, to earn that status. So you know, the COVID pandemic didn't help because we've pretty much shut ourselves from an air travel perspective. But you know, post-COVID, post-pandemic, I really think Hong Kong needs to get back on its feet and tell its story to the rest of the world and demonstrate it through actions.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And thank you so much for that answer. Now, just before we end off, we just have one final general question, and that's, do you have any general advice for the future generation of leaders who are present in the audience today? As someone who's been, you know, so involved with just public service and everything throughout.
I would say, I think one or two things. Most of the audience here are from Harvard. You're all bright and smart, no doubt about that. Two things I want to say. One is one has to really stay very curious to feel that desire to learn more, to know more. And I don't mean just by formal learning, but also just in everyday life. I think that is so important to personal growth, staying curious. Most of you may already be like that, but I think it's worth emphasizing. The other one I want to say, you know, in this day and age with information, with news, and I'm not here to talk about fake news, don't worry. But in this day and age, it's very easy to be fed with, to be passively fed with news or information in general. You know, with that curious mind that I spoke about earlier, it's so important to for each and every one of you to actively go seek more information, go seek more news, constantly broaden your sources, broaden your input, and that I think allows you to have a clearer, sharper mind from everyone else.
Those are some excellent lessons. And with that, thank you so much, Mr. Lau, for that wonderful fireside chat we've had. I know you're quite busy, so I'll let you go on your way now. But thank you, and thank the audience for joining us today.